Ethan Behrman, Left Coast News.
Thank you so much for joining me here on Dispatch 45. And first things first, I want to ask you a big favor. Please share the podcast with others who you think may enjoy, and even if they might not. Share it on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, wherever, and please subscribe in your favorite platform, be it iTunes or Spotify, or right on the website, leftcoastnews.ethanbehrman.com. Really appreciate it. Well, many of you know that I was a supporter of Beto O'Rourke, who entered the presidential race on March 14th, 2019. He was a three-term congressman from the state of Texas, and he had been on the city council. He narrowly lost to Senator Raphael Edward Ted Cruz last year for the United States Senate for the great state of Texas, a state I have much love for. I met my wife in Dallas, and I've spent years there as well. I'm originally from Minnesota and live in California, of course, now, and have for many, many years. But I love Texas. It's a great state, great people. Some of the friendliest people I've ever met anywhere in the world are in the state of Texas. And I had a special fondness for Beto O'Rourke. I've met so many politicians, interviewed and met them over the years, and he was one of the rare ones who seems so genuine to me, who really listens, who really cares. And he dropped out of the race on Friday with these words.
We have to clearly see at this point that we do not have the means to pursue this campaign successfully.
Oh, man. It was, it was starting to feel like it was coming. It was starting to feel like it was coming. So it wasn't a total surprise. It hurt. It hurt a lot of people. He had a great base of volunteers who supported him and do continue to support him and are loyal to Beto. I got to know many of them, and so many of you I've connected with over the last couple of months, but Beto dropped out, and that's it. We don't know what's going to happen next. Maybe he becomes the VP candidate, because he was the only one, in my mind, who could pick up the 38 electoral votes in the great state of Texas. He was the dark horse candidate after the initial stumbles. Look, to his supporters who are listening to this right now, there were initial stumbles in the campaign. I'm going to talk to David Siders here in just a minute. He was one of the embedded reporters, and he was embedded from Politico. He's a national political reporter for Politico, and he's written about the end of the campaign, which again is just tragically sad to me. But here's the deal. While I know many supporters are really disappointed and are angry, and they feel like the media or the DNC really sunk Beto, look, I think that there's some rightful frustration there. You can't say I'm not going to vote. You can say it, but what a horrific idea that is. And let me explain why. Donald Trump is still the president of the United States of America, regardless of what you think. He's the president. And right now, unless the Democrats can really pull it together, Trump gets reelected. We've got to turn the swing states. We've got to get people out to vote. We've got to help support whoever the nominee ends up being. I am not ready to throw my support behind another nominee yet, another candidate yet. I like Joe Biden a lot. What people don't remember about Joe Biden. So for me, the environment is a really big deal. It's one of the most important topics. I really believe we are in a climate crisis. We need bold and strong action to address the pollutants that are weakening the resilience of our ecosystems. We know that the mass of insects is down, according to some measurements, up to 70%. We know that the nutrition content of fruits and vegetables compared to the seeds from the 1950s are as much as 50% lower in nutrition content, our fruits and vegetables nowadays. We know that species are going extinct at a rapid rate. We know that human beings are dumping poisons and toxic chemicals into our environment, and we're killing ourselves at a high rate of speed. It's terrible. We've got to make it a focus. One of the contenders in the Democratic primary is Joe Biden. And what I believe his campaign has not done a good enough job on is pointing out he's the original environmentalist in the United States Senate. He brought the very first environmental legislation related to climate change to the United States Senate in 1986. He's a leader on this topic. I love that. By the way, I love Senator Kamala Harris. I want take a listen to this from CBS's Face the Nation.
There were some curious comments by Mayor Pete Buttigieg this weekend. He's trying to suggest now that this is becoming a two-person race between him and Senator Warren.
Well, I think that's just it's naive for him to think that at this point. The fate of this election has been determined. Just look at history. You might need to review past elections to know that what's happening right now is not necessarily determinative of the outcome.
I just love that she laughed at that because it's ridiculous that anybody says, well, it's between Warren and Buttigieg at this point. You know, it's silly to say that. Not a single vote has been cast. We know who's raising money. We know who has a better ground game that's going on right now. I will say this very bluntly. Mayor Pete is not my top pick. He is not it. Right now, I really like Joe Biden. I think he's very, very strong. We need to win. The number one goal to me is to defeat Donald Trump, no matter what that means. And if Donald Trump is not in office and he's not running for president, then we need to defeat the Mike Pence, the Steve Bannon-backed popular, whatever that looks like. I don't want that person in office. We need a Democrat taking over the presidency again. I like Joe Biden. Look, I like Senator Warren a lot. I think she's very smart. I think has some weaknesses that are happening right now. Bernie, his time was 2016. I really like Senator Cory Booker. I really like Senator Amy Klobuchar. I definitely like Senator Harris. She's another one where the couple of the weaknesses that I really see with Senator Harris and Mayor Pete, and I know I'm going to get some Senator Harris supporters mad at me for this. Look, she wins the nomination. I'm behind her 100%. Let me just make that clear up front. I feel like she needs a little more experience on the national stage. I just do. Mayor Pete has no national experience. I don't know why he is getting the level of support he has. He is LGBT, which is great, and I love the idea of having an LGBTQ president. But he's the mayor of a small town. He's a nice guy. He's smart. He has military service. He has a very bright future ahead of him. Do I think he's ready to be president of the United States of America? No, not at all. I don't think so. And I think that's not the right move at this point. I think somebody like a Joe Biden can step in on day one and be a strong president and help right our ship and the world after the damage that Donald Trump has done. So I'm leaning Joe Biden. I'm not ready to commit to that. Maybe it is Senator Harris. Maybe it is Senator Warren. I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your comments. Please comment below wherever you're watching this. Send me your feedback on Twitter, YouTube, leftcoastnews.ethanbehrman.com. You can always email me, leftcoastnews@ethanbehrman.com. Let's get to the interview, though. David Siders is a national political reporter for Politico. He was embedded with the Beto campaign. He's been writing about Beto very fairly, I thought, throughout. I think David is an excellent journalist. And take a listen to our conversation. I want to start a little bit at the beginning. How did you get involved covering? Did Politico assign you, or did you choose to go cover Beto while he was running for president?
Oh, it's a little of both. I'm based in L.A., so El Paso was pretty close. And right after his Senate race, there was some interest in seeing what was going on in El Paso. So I volunteered to go down there. And then, as these things happen, you just kind of get into a groove.
So when you first started covering his campaign, obviously nobody was thinking, oh, this is going to dwindle down to single digits and he's going to drop out, in the middle of debate season.
Yeah. I mean, initially, if you go back and look at where he was right after the Senate race, I mean, I think it was a couple of weeks after he lost to Ted Cruz that he had his first kind of public event in El Paso, which was he was still in Congress at the time, and it was a regular town hall. And reporters were flying in to see if he was going to run for Senate, because at the time he was polling third in the presidential race behind Biden and Bernie Sanders. He'd raised $80 million. He had this huge email list. Donors were holding up support for other candidates while they waited for him to make a decision. And I think at the time he really didn't know. I mean, it was just bizarre. You had a candidate asking reporters asking him, "Are you going to run for president?" And he says, "I don't know." And he says, "Go ahead and talk to my wife." And Amy's in the back saying, "This is kind of surreal." And I think he didn't know at the time, and reporters didn't know, but there was definitely not an expectation that he would be a 2%, 1% candidate if he did end up getting into the race.
So when we look back, when he did decide to finally jump in, I remember talking about it on my radio show that Kamala Harris had this huge event up in Oakland, California. 20,000 people showed up. She had polled some of the key Obama people. Do you think that delay hurt him, from what you see?
I do. I'm not sure the timing hurt him. I think it's what happened to get ready for that time. So he announced in March, the Senate race ended in November. He had several months there. I think entering the race without a campaign manager announced, without any real infrastructure to take advantage of the obvious interest that he had in his campaign was a crucial mistake. And he, I think, just bizarrely alienated a lot of people. He definitely alienated members of the press, and that turned out to matter. I think in the Senate race, he was so good on social media, he had such a following that there was a belief that he could bypass kind of the traditional press, which many candidates may want to do. It's not necessarily a great thing to have to be, if you're a candidate, to have to be dealing with the jackals that we are, right? But it turned out that I think that was a critical thing, because he did come in for a lot of hits.
So wait a second. I want to drill into that for a second, because, I'm very involved with a lot of volunteers and have become friends with a lot of people who were strong Beto supporters. And there is a real belief that the media took Beto down. What do you see as this misstep that upset the media so much?
Right. Well, and first, let me say that the people who think the media took Beto down need to go back and read the volumes of hagiographies written about him during the Senate race and even during the presidential run. There's another camp of people who think that Beto benefited from an inordinate amount of media attention, that nobody would even be talking about a former congressman who lost a Senate race if not for bizarre media interest. Stacey Abrams might. I haven't heard her make that complaint, but she could. But
the opposite of there, of course, would be Pete Buttigieg, which is, so you're a mayor of a small Midwestern city. How do you get this media attention? I mean, that would be the counter argument, of course. So the media is fascinated with Mayor Pete. The media was fascinated with Beto, and then they, again, in the minds of a lot of supporters, they turned on Beto. But from your perspective, because you're in the media, what causes people in the media to suddenly say, I mean, you're not just in the media, you're a political reporter for Politico, okay? And you're a national coverage guy, and you've been at the forefront of covering California politics and so many things. What causes some of these people, and it's only some of the people in the media, to suddenly say, you were our darling, now you're not? What do you see as the or those missteps?
Well, I think there is in naming Buttigieg there's a good example. If you look at Buttigieg's campaign, that was a candidate who, a year before getting in, when nobody would ever talk to him, I mean, this was a candidate who, if you called up from, any green room in the country, if you called up from any weekly newspaper, a shopper, whatever, that person would spend time with you. And there is some art to getting the press familiar with a candidate so that they recognize each other on more human terms. They may be more apt to. The example that I think some people close to Beto often point to is the reboots that happened in his campaign. Complaining that when Buttigieg was having a hard time, it would be described as a new phase. And I think some of it just is the reality too. So the press sees. In the candidate's treatment of the press sees the candidate's organization. So if a campaign can't tell reporters where the candidate's first public event is going to be. I mean, really basic things. They also may recognize that similar complaint when governors and lawmakers and county party chairs call the reporters and say, I've been trying to get a hold of Beto, and it's really weird. Other presidential candidates return my calls, as you would expect, not his campaign. So I do think because the disorganization was so apparent to the media, it allowed that story to be told more easily. And I do think that's really the story of Beto's kind of fall, is that there just wasn't enough organization early enough to cement the enthusiasm that he had around him. Now, they got it later on. They got a really top flight team in El Paso. I think they righted their relationship with the press, but with donors and Democratic Party activists. But it was too late.
Yeah, and that's the key. I mean, because when I look at it from my perspective, that is the difference. Mayor Pete, it's just a perfect contrast. I believe, now I don't have insight specifically to this, I believe that his campaign actively worked to connect with the DNC, to connect with certain donors, really went out of their way to make that a focus. And I just didn't get the same feeling from Beto, where it was, hey, we're grassroots, which is very Bernie style. But Bernie had done that for a long time and had built that grassroots. And 2016 was the culmination of a lot of work by Bernie. I just bluntly, I've said this repeatedly, 2016 was Bernie's year. It's not 2020. And, he still has influence and everything else. This just isn't going to be his year. But he built that over a long period of time. Beto didn't have that longevity of building that outside of anything beyond the borders of Texas.
I think you're right. I mean, he had a huge national donor list. I mean, on day one, he still raised, what, 6 million, 6.1 million?
Yeah.
So that takes him to mid-March, where he's still, despite the lack of organization, that email list did something. But then it really did. Then it did fall apart. You're right. He didn't have and he wasn't tested. I mean, in part it's the connections that you have, but it's also how good a candidate you are. And it's a different ballgame when you're running for president than when you're running for Senate. It just is. I mean, in the one game, it's him versus a Republican loathed by
everybody, including
everywhere.
Republicans.
Yes. And O'Rourke came in from criticism, and I do think we might overplay did the media do this to Beto thing. I'm not sure that that's true. I think it's more the media reflected some serious problems that he had, and one of them he had from the outset was that he didn't really have a clear lane or base of support. I remember asking him, "Are you a progressive Democrat?" And I was surprised when he said, "I don't know," because I just assumed, of course he would say in this primary climate, "Yes, I am," but instead he says, I'm not big on labels. And then he comes in for this huge attack from the left. It looks like he might run as a more kind of centrist Democrat. And
right.
I see him over the months push very far to the left. I think now, I haven't asked him recently, but I imagine he would say he's a progressive Democrat. He didn't have a very clearly defined lane or base of support.
And yet, at the same time, his volunteers were some of the most dedicated that I've seen. They love Beto. One of the reasons I got behind Beto is I've met maybe not quite as many politicians as you have, David Siders, but I've met many politicians. And what always struck me about Beto and why I was so supportive of him running for president was here was a politician running for president who cared, who actually listened to people, whose arrogance didn't seep through, who's, talking to the people out and about for free and not charging huge money to get a picture taken with him, was genuine. Every time I watched him interact with people, I was amazed that here was actually a genuine human being trying to understand people and connect with people. And I think that's such a rare quality in politicians. So for me, that's a disappointment with Beto dropping out, where it's like, wow, there was somebody who actually listened. I've met so many cynical, crappy people who are politicians and successful at it. And so it's for me to run into somebody who I was like, wow, really genuine, good guy, and just missed these other pieces, So let me phrase the question for you then, David Zeiders, which is, you've met a ton of politicians. Did you get that feeling from him too, or did you have a very different perspective of who Beto was on the campaign trail?
Oh, I think your instincts are right. I think he's a genuine, I think he's genuinely interested in listening to other people. And that the whole beginning of the campaign where it was all, I'm here to listen to you, what are your ideas? I mean, this is a guy who would pull his notebook out, right, at meetings and take notes. I think this was a big part of what he liked about campaigning, was listening to people, meeting people. It may not have been as ferocious as the Democratic electorate was looking for, but I do think I don't doubt his genuineness. And you're not alone in having that initial perception. I think Obama said, and one of the reasons that, or added anyway to the national conversation around O'Rourke early, was Obama saying that his Senate run, one of the reasons it was so appealing was because it didn't feel poll tested. It felt genuine. And I think that's true.
Yeah, I really do agree with that. So I want to go back to one more area of this before I come to a more concluding question for you, David. But I want to go back to what you said about the campaign not being organized. This is actually a genuine concern. When I would talk to people about Beto and ask questions, a lot of what I heard was, some of those early missteps. They were like, well, then how can you be president? Because president needs to run the country, needs to pick the right people, needs to organize the government. The president doesn't do everything. Trump is maybe let's not go there. But you need to be able to run a very large organization. That's why Republicans love this idea of a businessman president. But that's why a lot of Democrats recognize you have to pick the right people to do the job for you. And so even just 2 weeks ago, I still was hearing from people who were not Beto supporters. And I would say, well, why not? Well, look at that Vanity Fair cover. That's where the right team that you've put in place that knows what they're doing would have controlled that message, would have had some input on the Vanity Fair cover. So I know you talked about the team that he put together kind of after the fact, once it was a little bit too late. Do you see that? I still sense some of that, though, even more recently, that there was, again, he's such a good guy, but he didn't always surround himself with all of the right people to get the job done for him. And those early mistakes contributed to it. But that was an argument against him that I heard from a lot of people, which was, look, you're going to have to get the right people the first time because we don't need another Trump in office. What do you think of that?
That's it. I hadn't thought about the implications for what it would mean for how you govern. That's interesting. My thought on the team that he has currently is that, at least from Democrats I talk to, that's probably one of the most highly regarded team of professionals around. Jen O'Malley-Dillon, his campaign manager, was highly sought after and was so good that people who were on the fence about O'Rourke after he started to slide, staffers, the fact that he was able to hire her and get her to move to El Paso, I think helped him to really build a team there, because staffers who were, even if they were nervous about O'Rourke's possibilities, saw it as an opportunity to work with Jen. And he really did have a stellar team. And if you look at the results, by summer, this is a candidate who had released some of the most detailed policy plans out there, which really ran against the narrative that was set up early, which I think was his own doing, which was that he was light on policy, because initially he was light on policy.
I just want to chime in on that. His policy team was incredible. Yeah, he had, and yet Elizabeth Warren gets all the credit for policy, not Beto O'Rourke. His policy team was absolutely stellar. I agree with you. Sorry, continue, please.
No, you're fine. So I just think it was an issue of timing. By the end, he'd stabilized the relationship with the media. I think he was much more responsive to Democratic activists in early states.
But I don't think that he did stabilize his relationship with the media. There were the pundits, other than basically me and Nicole Wallace, were brutal to him every chance that they got. It was, so maybe from the reporters' embedded coverage, and maybe that's what you're talking about, but the pundits were brutal to Beto O'Rourke from midsummer on, or early summer on, when I was really kind of paying attention to him and talking about him. So the pundits, though, control the narrative as much as, what you write in Politico, David. So what they're saying on CNN and MSNBC, and for that matter, me on Fox, it helps create a narrative. And they were just absolutely brutal to him. Like I said, with the exception of that, off the top of my head, me and Nicole Wallace.
I guess I can't speak to. I'll have to take your word on it. I can't speak to that. But I'll take your word. I will say, for a candidate polling as low as he was, the number of times he was interviewed on cable was rather remarkable, and the continuing media interest. I mean, you would routinely hear from other 2%er candidates saying, Beto O'Rourke is now polling at 2%. He's raising less than we are. Why is there still this interest in him that's not being shared elsewhere?
Because he has
charisma.
I
don't know, maybe
he has charisma.
There is some of that.
Yeah,
definitely. I mean, back to your point, I think it was just a timing thing. I think I would really like to have seen how this campaign got put together had he had that professional staff on 3 months earlier. And I don't know, maybe the outcome would have been the same. Maybe the ideological issues he had, or the lack of a lane, some of the things that, it would have been a problem anyway. Maybe those still would have been too much, but it's an odd lesson in I think the fact that some of these nuts and bolts in presidential campaigns matter a lot. Maybe more than the charisma of the candidate.
Yeah. I mean, again, so Bernie had the charisma in 2016, still lost. So the nuts and bolts absolutely matter. One final question for you, David Siders, is you got to know Beto and his family, over the months as well. When he says, I'm done, and he ruled out a Senate run and everything else, what do you see? I know this is not, that you're not a prognosticator necessarily, but what do you see happening next for Beto with this surprise announcement of him dropping out of the race, withdrawing from the race?
I've never been in the O'Rourke's going to run for Senate camp, and I'm still not, but that doesn't mean I won't be checking. I think the filing deadline in Texas is early December, maybe it's December 9th. So it's certainly, I don't know. I know he likes campaigning a lot. On the other hand, I think it also wears on him. He missed the family. He missed El Paso. Frankly, I would have thought it was more likely if he would run for governor, or even mayor of El Paso. Now, when I talked to him last and asked him, he said, absolutely, he has no interest, and I'm inclined to take him at his word, with one caveat, that during the Senate race, he was asked if he would run for president, and said at that time, no. So I don't think he was lying then. I think that he wasn't planning to run for Senate, but I think circumstances change, and I think it's entirely possible that he becomes convinced that he should run for something else down the road.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see what he does next, because just to disappear at this point makes no sense either. He has a lot of, like you said, connections to the email list. He's made a lot of friends across the country, and I would like to see him do more with all of that. So David Siders, look, always appreciate your time. National political correspondent in Politico. Follow David at David Siders. Thank you so much for joining me today, David.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that is one set of perspectives, of course, as to what happened with Beto's campaign. I would love to hear your thoughts. Please comment again on any of the social media platforms at Ethan Behrman, Facebook, Ethan Behrman Show. You can always send me your messages, Left Coast News at ethanbehrman.com. Again, thank you so much for listening. Please like, please share, please subscribe. Your support matters to me. Thank you so much. I'll talk to you on the next dispatch.